He is our Vice President of Government Affairs. Someone who came to CCL after getting a PhD in oceanography from Scripps. Why? Because he wanted to understand our climate system and specifically past warming and cooling cycles, which would help him counter human-caused warming. So that was back more than 10 years ago, and he was a volunteer during that time with CCL. And then while in grad school, our next speaker, in Washington, D.C. He has been responsible for, among other things, CCL's overall legislative and overseeing CCL's research program, which has led to the RUNY study, household impact study, and dividend delivery study. Now, for the inside scoop on the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividends Act, please welcome Dr. DeAnger.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, we'll dive right in. Thank you for that kind introduction, and let's start with some updates. So first of all, the Climate Solutions Working Group. Of course, you have already been informed that Senator Romney will also be a part of that. We still don't know exactly how many pairs will be in the working group in the Senate. We know that Senator Coons and Senator Braun will be the co-chairman, and we know Romney will be in there, but we don't know who else will be in there. We don't know exactly what they will work on or how they will work on it. So until we know that, we're not suggesting that you invite your senators to join. Of course, this is moot for our folks from Utah, but for everybody else, hold off. What we do know is that they wanted people who could act in this working group, and they wanted to act by consensus. So they don't want it to be too big, and they only want people who are going to be really active in there. So while we're asking you to hold off on asking your senators to join at this time, you can certainly talk about it. It is public that it is happening. You can say how great you think it is. For right now, let's just stay back from inviting our senators to join. Another exciting thing that happened last week was that the Market Choice Act was introduced. It was introduced with 2 Republicans, Rooney and Fitzpatrick, and 2 Democrats, Carbajal and Peters. This makes 4 bipartisan bills introduced this Congress, and we have another Republican name in the mix finally. So this is really good. Last Congress, market choice was referred to 7 committees. And so I want to talk about committee assignments and the role that that can play in allowing a bill to get passed. You want your bill referred to as few committees as possible. It's like golf. And so the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act was referred to 3 committees. The SWAP Act, the Rooney-led bill, was referred to 3. And the Raise Wages Cut Carbon Act, that was the Lipinski-led bill, that was referred to 4. I expect market choice to be referred to 7 committees again. And just for comparison of just how much big this can get, Coons's Carbon Action Rebate Act was referred to 10. Now, why is it better to have fewer committees? Why is committee assignments like golf? Well, remember, for a bill to pass, first it gets referred to committee, then the chairman of that committee has to schedule that bill for markup. And then the committee has to vote on it, and they have to pass it out of committee. And so if you have a bill that was referred to 3 committees, that's 3 chairmen who you have to convince to schedule that bill for markup. If you have a bill that is referred to 10 committees, like Coons's Climate Action Rebate Act was referred to, then that's 10 committee chairmen, individual people who can say, I just won't schedule this for markup, and then it never goes to the floor. And so that's why committee assignments is like golf. So market choice was introduced. 7 is a lot harder to get through than 3, but nonetheless, we're really excited to get that in there. And another piece of news that is particularly exciting for me is that I was interviewed on NPR last week. Some of you may have seen this, some of you may have listened to this. This was my first time on National Public Radio, and I'm not even going to pretend like this was not a big deal or that I'm not extremely excited about that. But this is also exciting for CCL as a whole. The purpose of this program was not to talk about carbon prices or carbon fees or carbon taxes generally. It was to talk about HR 763 specifically. And the reason that the producers of this show found out about this was because the producer had read that Time magazine article about HR 763 that came out in July. And so that's really exciting. And now that this has gone out on National Public Radio, maybe some other people will have listened to it and they'll be asking, what is this HR 763? Again, really exciting that this program was on HR 763 specifically. And this also speaks to our growing clout and influence in Washington, D.C. When I hired our two senior directors of government affairs, Ben and Andres, the last question that I asked them in their interview was, when the final bill is being passed and the sausage is being made, CCL wants to have a seat at the table. Can you get us a seat at that table? So you can imagine that was quite a question to ask in an interview, but their answers were excellent. And now I think that we do have a seat at that table, and I do think that they both helped us get there. How do we have a seat at the table? Well, we got the first bipartisan carbon pricing bill in 9 years introduced in November of last year. Then we got one in the Senate, which was the first time the bipartisan companion pricing bills, carbon pricing bills, had been introduced in both the House and Senate. Then, 1 month later, for the hat trick, the House bill was reintroduced. Last week's bipartisan market choice reintroduction brought the total number of carbon pricing bills up to 8, 4 of them being bipartisan, but none of them have as many co-sponsors as HR 763. Just checked, and we now have 65 co-sponsors on this bill. And this is particularly incredible because it feels a little bit hard to remember this, but it's been less than a year since this bill was first introduced. It was introduced in November of last year, and here we're sitting in September, so it's only been 10 months. And to go from never having seen the light of day to being the most co-sponsored carbon pricing bill ever is really because of CCL volunteers. There's just no way around it. These other bills have been introduced by very smart think tanks. They had really great lawyers write them up. They've had really wonderful members of Congress introduce them. And right now, I don't think any of them has cracked 10 co-sponsors. And I think that the record for a carbon pricing bill is 38 co-sponsors. And again, we're sitting at 65. The only way to explain this success is our volunteers throughout the country, you guys included, having conversations with their members of Congress that are based on appreciation and respect, on finding common ground, and over a course of years. So that's really the only thing that separates us from them. But that's a pretty big separation. So I just want to say, you guys should all be taking credit for this. You should be giving credit to your fellow volunteers. The reason why CCL has been this successful, the reason why the Energy Innovation Act has been this successful is because of you. Some other things that I'm noticing in DC is that number one, members of Congress are increasingly coming to the DC office or to our volunteers asking about our opinion on their bills. We're also getting requests to review bills and to provide input around them, and even sometimes to make asks around these bills. And this has never really happened before. Certainly not with this level of frequency, but this is a sign again that CCL our clout is growing. People have noticed that we have done something that has never been done before. They've noticed that we have you in the field, and you are very effective. And so people are starting to come to us for our opinion, our blessing, which is really, really cool. Now, we also have a very good reputation on the Hill. It's not perfect, but we do hear things like 2 Fridays ago, a Republican office said to Ben, you know, CCL is the only climate group that I'm not afraid to meet with. And that's, so I mean, these are the kinds of things that offices are saying to us. And this growing, good, glowing reputation also extends to hiring. I have had more than once the experience of having an experienced professional in DC who was working for another environmental NGO inquire to see if CCL is hiring. They're interested in working with us. We're the team who is getting things done that they see moving the ball forward more than the organization that they're working at. And that for me is extremely, extremely gratifying. It's a sign, I think, of a maturing organization, an organization that outsiders see as having great effect and an organization that they want to work for. So things are going really well. It's a fun time to be associated with CCL right now. We're doing things that people had long believed were impossible. And as things seem to start to be moving a little bit quicker, we are well positioned to, again, to have that seat at the table. So I'm very excited. I also want to give a couple of other political considerations right now. So where we're at. We are still very anxious to get Francis Rooney more Republican company on our bill. And so we're working very hard to do this. And one opportunity that we see for when this might get easier is after the primary filing dates. So once Republicans know whether or not they're going to have a primary challenge because of gerrymandering, most Republicans in the House are more concerned of their primary challenge facing another Republican than they are of their general. But after those primary filing dates, when they know whether or not they're going to have a Republican challenger, then they're more concerned about their general election when they're going to be facing off against a Democrat. And in that instance, it might be advantageous for them to co-sponsor a carbon pricing bill. And so the first of those primary filing dates come and go in March. So that's a date to start to think where we might start to see some more action. Of course, we want it to happen way, way, way before then. We want it to happen now. But it's nice to know that we should expect the politics of this to get a little bit easier at that time. Second, we still really, really, really want to see a Senate bill introduced. I think that this Climate Solutions Working Group will help with that. At a minimum, Senator Coons is the Democratic chair, and he's also the lead on the Energy Innovation Act. And even if the working group as a whole is not dedicated to writing and introducing a bill, a carbon pricing bill, or reintroducing the Energy Innovation Act, the fact is he'll be having more discussions with more Republicans on the topic of climate within this working group. And so even if a bill doesn't come out as a result of this working group and doesn't have their consensus opinion, it's still an opportunity for Senator Coons to have one-on-one conversations, and he might find a pairing, a subset of that would want to introduce the bill anyway. So I think that the Senate working group is fantastic. I think it's still important to maintain a distinction that Senate working group doesn't exist to introduce the Energy Innovation Act, but even so, I still think that it can only help. So that's a political rundown, some things that I'm looking at, some things that I'm excited about, and just giving you a bit of a feel for what it's like to be working for CCL in DC. And now I want to pivot to something else, and this is the June analysis. So for the first time ever, I've completed the June analysis in record time, about 6 weeks earlier than usual. And the reason I've been able to complete that analysis so much earlier is because of Adeline DeYoung and Taylor Kraus, who are in the DC office. As I mentioned before, we've been spending months doing what we call the mind meld. where I teach Adeline and Taylor as they read through the notes to think like I do and to rank these notes like I do. And so with their help, we each took 1/3 of the notes and we were able to finish in record time. And so with all this extra time, we're able to do more analysis of the results. Before I was just getting the results, I really had about 2 weeks to write it up and make them look pretty before we had to have that out to you for the November Education Day. But with more time to do analyses, one of the things that we've already done is break out the results by region. And so what I'd like to do with you now is share the results for the Wild West region with you and to pull out some things that jump out at me. So first of all, let me share my screen with you. Okay. Now, could you give me a thumbs up? Are you all seeing this on the screen?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. So what you're looking at here on the left, you have all the topics that we tracked. I think we tracked 72 this time, arranged by the order in which they were most frequently mentioned for all of Congress, the whole of Congress. And so what you can see here is the dividend came up in 27% of meetings, supporting ask bills came up in 27% of meetings, the border or mentions of China or India or mentions of the WTO came up in 21% of meetings. Endorsers came up in 20% of meetings. The Green New Deal came up in 19% of meetings. And interestingly, bridge, wedge, or bipartisanship and an interest in that approach also came up in 19% of meetings, and so on. And what you can also see is that these are colored. And what these colors mean, fire is red and fire is hot, and ice is cool and ice is blue. And so hotter topics that came up more often are in red, and cooler topics that didn't come up as often, they're in darker shades of blue. So that's what the colors mean. And 10% is in between, it's white. And so right next to this, you have same order, but for the Wild West, what were the hot topics in your region? So just for the members of Congress in your region. And what you can see just looking at the colors is that these numbers are quite different. The order is quite different. So the number one topic for your region is still the dividend. But then the next biggest, most frequently mentioned topic is bridge, wedge, bipartisanship, and carbon capture and sequestration, coming up in 23% of your meetings. So I've shared this with Bill Barron, your regional coordinator, and what this means is that for your region, you still want to, my IP address is showing. You still want to focus on the dividend, but you and your region might want to really play up the bridge wedge bipartisanship. That seems to be working. And you might want to focus on carbon capture and sequestration. For the country as a whole, that's topic number 10, but for you guys, it's topic number 2. So Bill might want to have you guys focus on that more. And so going over here, there's also some surprises. So here, energy storage, 16% of meetings for you guys, but only 6% for the country as a whole. And then way down here, 12%, tied in a 5-way tie for number 9, truly revenue neutral or fraud. So your members of Congress are more concerned than members of Congress from the rest of the country that this policy is subject to fraud or that it will be truly revenue neutral, that they have a lack of trust that the government will actually return this. And this is coming up in 12% of meetings, 1 out of every 9 meetings for you guys. And so I've reorganized this, the topics that came up in at least 10% of meetings here. So here you have your Wild West rank. One, you have a 2-way tie for second, a 2-way tie for fourth, a 2-way tie for sixth, you have an 8th, and then a 5-way tie for 9th. And so when you look at these, the topics that you guys should be focusing on are dividend, bridge not wedge, or carbon capture and sequestration, the border, endorsers, low-income households, energy storage, jobs, the Green New Deal, polling. So that would be the Luntz polling or Yale Project on Climate Communications, climate and military, the Paris Agreement, and truly revenue neutral or fraud. And so what I should have been doing is going down here, Wild West. You can see that these topics are much more truly revenue neutral fraud. That only came up in 3% of meetings for the country as a whole. For you guys, again, 12%. So I'm really excited about this. I'm really excited that this will help you guys be better prepared for your meetings by region. I've given this information comparable to this, not just to Bill, but to all the regional coordinators, so that they can provide a more specific training and be more strategic with what you guys might reasonably expect out of your members of Congress. One other thing that I will highlight, though, is here in June on supporting ask bills, 27% of meetings overall. In Wild West, only 9% of meetings. And that's even though there's a Wild West senator, Senator Barrasso out of Wyoming, who was the lead co-sponsor on one of those supporting asks. So I'll just highlight that as potentially a missed opportunity to highlight, I believe it was the Use It Act, a Republican senator from a coal state who was nonetheless had his name on a bill that is complementary to the Energy Innovation Act. And come November, for those of you who are going to November, getting a higher rate of making that supporting ask and thinking about the Wild West region and how to elevate the senators from that region, that might be a way to improve moving forward. And so that's what I wanted to share with you all today. And I also wanted to allow a lot of time for questions, which I think we have. So I'll ask for your questions.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Danny. We've got a couple of volunteers that are going to be running around with the microphones. Dan, the other one's up there, Dan and Lindsay. And Danny, the way it's going to work is we'll get a question from the audience and then I will repeat it to you just because that'll go fast.
Perfect. That'll be good.
Good.
Any questions?
Hi, is that recent graph available on the CCL website?
Is that recent graph available on a CCL website?
I made it like 50 minutes before this presentation. So, I mean, we're good, we're quick, but I will make sure that Bill Barron has access to that graph, and I'll leave it up to him to get it out to you guys.
Okay, folks, let's get those. Dig deep for some questions. There's some back there. Danny's a man when it comes to talking about strategy for CCL and for the Energy Innovation Act. So we're going to hit you up with a bunch of them, Danny.
Okay, good. I'm excited.
Go for a technical question on the Energy Innovation Department. That's okay. We're having a hallway conversation about the taxability of the dividend.
Mm-hmm.
The answer was that is the one piece of everything we're doing that I need a better explanation on, and I really need it from you. And I heard your explanation in June on this same question, and I have to tell you that I'm up to speed that far, and I'm still not satisfied.
Okay.
So I need more on why we are actually revenue neutral, despite the fact that you're taxing it.
Revenue neutral refers to the government deficit. It doesn't refer to individual households. So CCL has talked about this in a confusing way for a long time, unfortunately. But what it means is that the federal government deficit does not increase. And so when you raise a certain amount of money and that goes into government coffers, that means that that money is not being used for something else, either hiring or it's for corporate taxes, for example. Corporations only pay taxes on their profits. And so if you increase the amount of money that companies have to pay for fossil fuels, that's less money that is going into their profits. So the federal government assumes that they are actually reducing the amount of revenue they're getting from those corporate taxes or from payroll taxes because people are hiring less. And so if you raise $100 billion through this fee, the federal government will assume they're raising $25 billion less from someplace else. But if you return $100 billion, then the federal government is out $25 billion. They also say that if you make it taxable, and if you turn it as a dividend and you make that taxable, they will assume that they will get that back in income taxes. So that's what the government assumes. That's why the dividend is taxable. The alternative would be to only return 75% of the revenue and to let the government keep 25%. So that's not great. That makes it less progressive because the poor, the bottom 20% of the country, they basically don't have any federal tax liability. But instead of getting $1 back, they're only getting 75 cents back. It's not taxable, but they don't pay taxes. So instead of getting $1, they get 75 cents. So if you make the dividend non-taxable and you want to have this be revenue neutral, this is the most progressive thing you can do.
Thank you, Dan.
I have a question about your list, your top 5 for the Wild West for dividends, bridge wedge, carbon capture, border, and endorsers. I understand the first 4 as issues, but what do you mean when you went through the forms and wrote down endorsers, and how do we make use of that in terms of working with our congressman? What does it mean, this item number 5 called endorsers on your list?
Yeah, so I think I heard that. So the endorsers, that's just when usually our volunteers will bring forward the endorsements that they've gotten in their district or their state, or they'll ask a question about who is important. And Taylor, Adeline, and I only marked it if the aide, not the CCL volunteer, if the aide said something substantive about that. And usually, in the case of endorsers, they were interested in it. Oftentimes, they would also say, it would be in response to what can we do more of in district. They can say, you can get more support in terms of these endorsers. And so what this means, my interpretation of why that's so high is that members of Congress are really interested in the work that you guys have been doing. And I know you guys have been exceptional in getting the National Ski Area Association, Protect Our Winters, so outdoor businesses, for example. That's super, super interesting to members of Congress. And so the way you can incorporate into your practice is you can bring beef up on all the endorsements that your region already has gotten and be prepared to talk about that in your next meeting. And you can go and get some more. And you should be pulling national endorsements. Those are interesting. And you can also be pulling local endorsements. Those are also very interesting. So that's what is meant by endorsers, and that's how it's played out in the June analysis. That's what I'm looking at, and that would be my recommendation for how you might act on that intelligence now that you have that this is of such great interest to your members of Congress.
Hello, Danny. I'd like to ask a question about carbon capture and sequestration.
Yes.
I've read a few of the bills that are in Congress right now concerned with carbon pricing. And the Feinstein bill mentioned both carbon capture and sequestration and explicitly mentioned open air capture in completely different sections. Now, in our bill, we talk about carbon capture and sequestration. I want to know who it applies to. Does it apply to open air capture? Are we particular about how the carbon is captured in the sequestration, or is that available for anybody?
Yes, great question. The bill is particular about that. And the thought in the discussions was that we didn't want to open this bill to the potential of, quote, breaking the bank. And so the only emissions that are eligible for a rebate for capturing CO2 and sequestering it safely and permanently are facilities that are burning covered fuels. And so if you're a facility and you're burning a covered fuel, and then you capture that fuel and you sequester that fuel, then you would be eligible for the rebate. It does not allow for a rebate for direct air capture of CO2 molecules that are from the past covered fuels. It has to be those covered fuels. And the reason for that was, again, a concern from members of Congress that they didn't want to break the bank. So, because if you were doing direct air capture, then you could envision a situation where this would be a happy situation where you're sequestering so much carbon that you actually have no money to give back in the dividend. So people would have costs, but they would have no dividend because those dividends are being paid to people who sequestered carbon dioxide directly from the atmosphere. And so this construction, making sure that it's just covered fuels, prevents that situation and makes sure that every year people will get a dividend, and that dividend will be one-to-one with the expected increase in costs. Not quite one-to-one because of pass-through issues, but basically, that's more technical. Sorry. I saw Dave Folland.
Hey, Cindy, did the revenue report, was that based on the dividend being taxed? And if not, how does that change the revenue report?
I asked this question to Scott Nystrom, the author of that report. He did not assume that the dividend was taxable, but he also said that it did not change the report. So I don't remember the details of why that is, but it did not assume a taxable dividend, but the way this model was structured, it would not have changed the results of the report. And that is because I asked Scott a direct question. I asked him that direct question. So that's the answer he gave me.
Hi, in that list of the top 10
Yes.
concerns in the Wild West, one of them was jobs.
Yes.
So if I wanted to write a letter to the editor and either nationally or statewide, what source can I use for how jobs would be affected in transitioning?
I think that we have a laser talk on jobs, and I know that I think that is being updated soon. And at November, this is really important because that was a top issue nationally as well as in your region. It's always been a top issue, and so I've been asking Jerry Hinkle, one of our research coordinators, we really need to do a better job of this. And the REMI study is fantastic, but it's also not exactly this bill, and it's now 5 years old. So I think that it's getting increasingly important to go to other sources. So I would start with the laser talk and the references there. Just generally, you can look at other. You can look at what happened in British Columbia. So British Columbia, even though they've had a carbon tax since 2008, they didn't see a hit on their economy, and they saw jobs grow, and in sectors that are similar to what the REMI study predicted. You can look at renewable energy, and so the number of people who are hired, the job intensity, the labor intensity for a given $1 million invested in wind or energy efficiency, it's 11 times as many jobs in energy efficiency as it is for, say, coal, oil, and gas. I think it's something like 7 for wind. So you can look at that labor intensity for a given amount of investment and looking at case studies. And this is absolutely an area of research focus. We want to be able to provide better resources for you in the near future.
Thank you, Danny. Susan, did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Sure.
Hey, Danny. I have a follow-up question on the CCS. If you rebate covered fossil fuels, I mean, it is well known that fossil industries have been putting CO2 back into the subsurface for decades to intensify the production of the extraction of fossil fuels. So I find it a bit interesting that you actually rebate that. doesn't that incentivize a continuation of fossil fuel-based economy?
Does that incentivize the continuation of a fossil fuel-based economy, was the question.
Yes.
I think that for me, so the language of the bill is written as only, the rebate is only for the CO2 that is captured, sequestered, and is likely to remain permanently underground. And so it might provide that incentive for longer, but at the same time, they're only getting a credit for what stays underground. So I see it as being quite fair in that you do get credit for putting stuff underground, which is better than not doing that. Liquefied CO2 for enhanced recovery is the number one, is a top use. I think it might be the number one use of CO2 in the United States, liquefied CO2. But if those molecules of CO2 are staying down and you're burning more fossil fuels, and you would have been burning those fossil fuels in another way anyway, I think it's fair. It might extend the life of the fossil fuel economy a little bit, but really I think that's more going to be determined by the price. The fee and the rapidly increasing fee. So possibly, but I don't think it's a strong incentive for that. I think it's pretty fair.
Thank you.
We had a talk today about farming and climate change, and I discovered the fact that whereas carbon payment would raise the production cost for farmers, they would not be able to pass those costs on directly to the consumers because a lot of those prices are pretty set. So how do we get farming communities on board with carbon payment dividend when that is their situation?
So I think the question is, how do we get farming communities on board with this, given that they buy on a retail market and sell on a commodities market? Is that the question? Yes. Well, one thing, going back to the carbon capture and sequestration thing, this was discussed in the meetings and that led up to the bill, and there's no minimum facility size on the CCS. And so one thing to talk about with farmers is to point out that the reason for that is so that fertilizer producers who do use fossil fuels and who do capture something like 95–97% of that CO2, if they wanted to, they could permanently sequester that CO2 and get a rebate. And that should limit the cost of fertilizers. Farmers know that their fertilizer comes from fossil fuels. And so it's not just, going back to the other question about does that extend the life of the fossil fuel economy, this keeps, this extends the life of the current way of making fertilizer. And I think that was made because of farmers. And you can also talk about with farmers, as we were writing the bill, there was a decision to put that exemption for agriculture. And we estimate that amounts to 0.6% of United States emissions that are part of that. And that cues off of the dyed diesel program. And so that was the inspiration for that exemption. The dyed diesel program is something that farmers are already used to. So they buy their diesel, it is literally dyed red. And the reason why it is dyed red is because it doesn't pay the gas tax. And so it's dyed red. So if you were to put some of that diesel into your truck and you were to drive it on a freeway, a cop could pull you over, or they could pull a little bit out of your fuel tank. And if it were to be red, you would be subject to a fine. That is illegal. You can only use that red dyed diesel off the roads in your tractors, et cetera, farm equipment. And so, but even if you do use diesel that has that excise tax on it, you can submit a form and get a rebate for that. So I would talk about those two provisions with farmers and say, look, the members of Congress who are writing this had you in mind. They agreed that you do have hardships. And they built in steps in the bill to make sure that American farmers remain healthy and strong and competitive internationally and domestically, and that you are appreciated. So those are a couple of points that whenever that comes up in a member of Congress office, I always draw to those 2 points, which were built into the bill with farmers in mind.
Thanks, Dan.
Hello, Danny. This is Bruce. How you doing?
I'm doing well, Bruce. How are you?
Pretty good. Well, how do you respond to this question that I'm starting to hear from the left? Is that if the senator supports carbon fee and dividend, it helps him get reelected, and Mitch McConnell continues to be a roadblock in the Senate for the next Congress?
Yeah, well, Mitch McConnell is a tough. He's tough. That is a roadblock, and so I would say that the only way you get past Mitch McConnell is first of all, let's say we are a bipartisan organization. That is who we are, and I also like to talk about we're working within a strategic ecosystem. And so there are different organizations that fill different niches. As a bipartisan organization, you could be posed with that question. You could decide, well, we got to get rid of Mitch McConnell. We need to have a Democratic majority in the Senate. I don't see CCL adding any value to that. And I see CCL losing a lot of value, and thus the ecosystem losing a lot of value if we do commit ourselves to a partisan pathway. There are very few organizations who have successfully as CCL, navigated the bipartisan space being shot at from the right and the left. And so I would concede that Mitch McConnell is a problem, but I would also say that there is value in having groups that are truly bipartisan, and there are value in groups who are taking a different approach. And it doesn't behoove the overall movement to all have one approach or the other approach. That is strategic monocropping. And if you have a monocrop, it's easier for one bug to just wipe out the whole thing. So I would acknowledge the problem and point to the value in having multiple strategic approaches, and in this case specifically a nonpartisan approach and partisan approaches.
Danny, I hope you saw the head nods and smiles in the room. We're in agreement.
Okay, good.
And great imagery.
In the past, I've noted that the November meeting has been called Education Days.
Yes.
This year it's listed as November Lobby Days. Does this represent a change in emphasis?
We got a bill out. So this was a discussion, and we see that there's greater value in pressing our advantage. So yes, it's a change in strategy with changing circumstances. Very, very, very perceptive.
Danny, is there anything else even beyond the question that you want to say in terms of the November Lobby Day?
Sure. I mean, I'll say that we will still be providing the June analysis for you, but number one, we want you to make the primary asks. Number two, we want you to make the secondary asks. And then number three, if you see it adding value, and only if you see it adding value, we want you to go with the June analysis. So it's going to be a tool. We're going to teach it. We're going to have it there for you to use if you want to. But the main focus of the November Lobby Day will be to lobby. It will not be to educate.
Thank you. More questions?
Thank you for all of this. I'm wondering what the latest CCL thinking is on just transition. I'm not sure how important that is across the board, but
yeah, that was one of the topics that I tracked, and it's really interesting. It doesn't. Let me check. So that's transition assistance. It came up in 5% of meetings with Congress. Within your region, it came up in 7% of meetings. So this is only 1 out of 20 offices who are bringing it up. So but you know, you see in DC, there are a lot of people who are very concerned about. I think people are also looking at Mitch McConnell, Kentucky, big coal state, and they're thinking that this has to be a part of the solution. That's not clear to me. It's not clear to me that members of Congress really care about that. And so, you know, our thinking has always been we wanted to have the simplest, cleanest policy possible, 100% dividend. Easy to understand, easy to communicate, harder to corrupt. And so, and especially for your region where truly revenue neutral and fraud came up in 12% of meetings, so as opposed to 7%, it would appear that your members of Congress are more interested in avoiding fraud and making sure that those dollars and cents go where they intend to, than to creating a new government program to provide assistance to displaced workers. So I think that it absolutely could enter into the discussion. And the way we view this is that we have advertised and made clear to our volunteers, we are for 100% dividend. It would take members of Congress who are necessary to get this passed saying, I will not vote for this, I will not support this unless there's transition assistance in this bill. And if those members of Congress, enough members of Congress who are important enough, do ask for that, then I would feel like I had the latitude to incorporate that into the negotiations. But I am cognizant of, I really want to be your voice, and I want to be consistent with what we have been selling to you and to all CCL volunteers, and that has not included this. So it's more people are talking about it. It could be a part of the final deal. I'm prepared to do that, but members of Congress are going to have to ask. I'm not going to do it if an NGO asks. I'm not going to do it if a subset of CCL volunteers ask. I'm only going to do it if the people who can actually pass this ask, and that's the only time in which I will deviate from what we've been representing to all of our volunteers for years.
Thank you, Danny. We'll take one, maybe two more questions. Lindsay, you have one in the back.
Okay, I'm just wondering with the British Columbia carbon tax, is there really enough time to assess its effect on that?
Did you hear the British BC tax? Has there been enough time to
Assess its effect on behavior?
To assess its effect on behavior?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, for sure. And so the tricky thing about the British Columbia carbon tax is that it started at $5, it increased $5 per year, and then it stopped at $30. I think I heard recently that it might be increasing again since Canada has a directive to all the provinces to get to $50 by 2022, but I'm not sure. And in those 6 years that it was increasing, they did see a noticeable effect of British Columbia relative to the rest of the provinces. And in fact, you can go to Australia. Australia is usually highlighted as a problem because they had a carbon tax. They were going to transition to a cap and trade, but then they decided to zero out the value of their carbon tax. But even in the very short amount of time that they had that in place, you could already discern changes in behavior, even for that short amount of time. So yes, there has been enough time for the British Columbia carbon tax to be measured. Doing so over this length of period becomes a little bit more difficult because there was that pause for so long. But if you compare the time when it was increasing, certainly British Columbia had actually a higher gross provincial product than other provinces. And they had declining carbon emissions relative to other provinces as well.
Good, thank you, Danny. We'll take our last very brief question and we'll call it good. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Energy storage was on your list of top 10 for the Wild West, and that's important for my state of Nevada for our future economy, but it's also rapidly changing and a little bit technical. Would it be possible for us to get some better education in the form of a blog post or forum or something in the November conference to understand a little bit more about the storage issues?
Yeah, so that is possible. I believe that one of the supporting asks for November is going to be an energy storage bill. I think it's the BEST Act. For the first time, we are going to be providing one-pagers for those supporting asks. So I do anticipate a one-pager for the BEST Act specifically. For the other supporting asks, I think right now we're looking at 5. That will be available before your lobby day, but you know, it's not going to be anything remotely comparable to what we have for the Energy Innovation Act. I mean, we've been focused on this thing for 9 years, so I guess we are looking to provide you more resources, but we just, you know, it's not going to be the same depth. That rabbit hole is going to be quite shallow up to the rabbit hole of CCL University and our studies and all the other things we have for the Energy Innovation Act. So, yeah.
Danny, thank you so much. Please stay with us long enough for us to give you a round of applause. Good, we're going to go on to a break.
All right, it was a pleasure being with you all. Enjoy the rest of your conference. Hope you get a lot of good work done. Thanks all.